Through a Glass Darkly. To every alcoholic who has ever lived or died. About the title. The quotation, of course, is from the Apostle Paul. Now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Its first meaning to some is that we understand alcoholism only imperfectly at present. To follow the biblical parallel, perhaps we shall never be able to understand in this life the tremendously complex and troublesome illness we call alcoholism. The second meaning to some is that the alcoholic sees everything through a glass, but in this case, a glass of booze is not a window. They see themselves through the bottom of the bottle, not in a mirror. There is a lot in this book about the imperfect perceptions of the alcoholic. The third meaning, again, is that those of us who would help the alcoholic see him imperfectly through a window of our own experience and bias, and there is quite a bit about this matter in this book. Preface. No one is more aware than I of the danger of writing a second book. It is presumptuous enough to feel that your thoughts are worth printing the first time, but to offer the world a second helping goes beyond reason. Once more, it has been the wisdom and encouragement of alcoholics that has prompted my writing. There is very little original thinking in these pages, but if at this time alcoholics can again say to me, "That's the way it is, you have learned well from us," well, my cup will be filled to overflowing. Robert Hickle, M.A. Alcohol works. For a while. We've got a problem here. Alcohol works, and works particularly well for alcoholics. In fact, the earliest symptom that I have learned to recognize is that alcohol does more for alcoholics from the very first stage of their drinking than it does for the rest of the drinkers. No matter what alcoholics want to be, taller, richer, or more successful with the other sex, well, alcohol will do it for them. It eases their tensions, cures their colds, lubricates their social life, and helps them perceive life with a clarity that they don't have when they are sober. It is only when the alcohol stops working for them that we label them alcoholic. We see that their perceptions of themselves are more and more inaccurate. We see alcohol becoming less and less productive of the things that its purveyors advertise. Its use becomes counterproductive. We can see it so plainly that we can't understand why the alcoholic can't see it also. As a matter of fact, they do see it. They just can't understand how this good friend has let them down. It always used to work. They know that the alcohol hasn't changed, so it must be them. And they go on trying with every technique at their command to go back to the good drinking. We see them go through the stage where alcohol works. Then the stage where it doesn't do anything. We see them go through the stage where alcohol works. Then the stage where it doesn't do anything. And then to the stage where it does just the opposite of what the alcoholic desires. Now we label them alcoholic and wonder why they don't quit. Their altered perceptions brought about using alcohol and the memories of the days where alcohol did work, they can't believe that alcohol has anything to do with their problems. It's up to us to convince them. It can't be the booze. It must be me. I once heard that alcoholism may be a disease, but it is the only disease we give each other for Christmas. Consider the plight of the alcoholic. From their very youngest memories, they have seen alcohol presented in a most favorable light. The media promotes alcohol as a benign force, which improves one's social life, gives life gusto, and finally becomes a measuring stick of success. They have heard the virtues of alcohol extolled by their peers. They have seen the federal and state governments give their blessing to its sale, and have envied the young, sophisticated, attractive, productive people who are said to be that way because they use alcohol. Even when they are fortunate enough to receive training about the use of alcohol, they are told if they use alcohol wisely, it will do nothing but good things for them. In the beginning, it does great things for them if they can ignore the occasions when it gets them into trouble as an unexplainable accident and settle down to a long, happy life of drinking. Gradually, those accidents increase in frequency and in duration and in depth. It doesn't seem to them that there can be anything wrong with the alcohol because they have not been exposed to that concept. Instead, they decided that there must be something wrong with the way they use alcohol, or finally, something is wrong with them. So they try to change the way they use alcohol. They try to change themselves. Some of the self-cures are cunningly conceived and are elaborately executed. When these brilliant schemes are discussed at AA meetings years later, they are met with hilarity that the non-alcoholic is hard-pressed to understand. They don't understand that the listeners who are laughing so hard have had the same experience with cleverly designed plans to change their drinking. The universal failure of these schemes is one of the bonds that ties recovering alcoholics together. Long ago at the governor's conference on alcoholism, a little lady got up before the experts, scuffled her tennis shoes a couple of times, and delivered these words. I have heard a lot of experts testify today about what causes alcoholism. I know what causes alcoholism. Drinking alcohol causes alcoholism. And she sat down. There wasn't much to add. It is only when alcoholics can grasp this simple truth that they can begin to travel the road to recovery. Nobody volunteers for help. Many times in a treatment center, one discovers a sort of caste system. One's caste is determined by whether an alcoholic volunteered for treatment or is there under some duress, such as a court order. It would be amusing if it weren't so sad to hear a patient hold forth in the coffee room that they really volunteered to come in. As a matter of fact, the sheriff, 11 creditors, their boss, and 3 neighbors are panting at their heels when they came through the door. Nobody volunteers for sobriety. Alcoholics begin seeking sobriety when they have exhausted every way they can think of to continue drinking. So often, we observe the twisting and turning and maneuvering that alcoholics go through for years and mistake it for a search for a way to quit drinking. It is seeking a way to continue drinking without the painful destructive pattern which has been going on. Alcoholics are the first to know there is something wrong with their drinking. They may not admit it consciously, but they know. Their lives are soon built around that fact. They try all the cures, the beer-only cure, the weekend-only cure, the geographic cure, the no drinking before 5 o'clock cure, the special occasions-only cure. They all have one thing in common. They fail. Finally, they are trapped. There is nowhere to turn. They have exhausted all the techniques they can think of. Then and only then do they seek help. No one seeks help voluntarily. The alcoholic seeks help only when driven by the very scourges of hell. The court order or the commitment papers or the sheriff escort are really the easy way to go. The toughest way of all is to volunteer for help. The power of surrender. Once I heard an alcoholic say that they had tried repeatedly to build a 12-story building starting with the second floor, and he couldn't understand why it kept falling. He meant, of course, that he had tried to live the AA program without taking the first step. It's worth repeating here. 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. The idea of surrender is so important in the recovery process that I think it's worth examining carefully. First, we should understand that to surrender doesn't mean to quit. It means that alcoholics must do something positive instead of all the negative things that they have been doing. Surrender in this context is something positive, an act of faith. It's interesting to discover in reading the New Testament that Jesus asked for an act of faith each time he performed a miracle. Many times, the act didn't make much sense to the recipient of the miracle. Fill the jars with water. Show yourself to the priest. Bring me the loaves and fishes. Each time, an act of faith was required. Surrender by the alcoholic is an act of faith, and recovery is a miracle. Often it makes no sense to the alcoholic to admit that their life is out of control. They've known that for years. But when they finally make the surrender, their recovery begins. To surrender to a higher power is the most powerful act of faith one can perform. Am I an alcoholic? Very frequently, someone comes to me with the question, am I an alcoholic? How do I know whether or not I'm an alcoholic? It is likely that the person asking the question is not, or they wouldn't be asking that question. If they were alcoholics, they would already know. But I give them 3 questions to ask themselves. If the answer to one of these questions is yes, they are probably alcoholic. If the answer to 2 of them is yes, they are most assuredly alcoholic. And if the answer to all 3 of them is yes, it's time to drop everything and head for the nearest AA meeting. Question number 1. Does the use of alcohol cause you problems in any major part of your life? Your family, your friends, your finances, your health, the police, or your job? Question number 2. Do you undergo a personality change when you drink? The person who is prudent financially becomes a big spender. The mouse becomes a lion. The sexual standards fall. Question number 3. Do you sometimes drink more than you intend to? Or drink at times and places where you didn't intend to drink? This only happens rarely at first, but as the disease progresses, alcoholics drink more than they intend to every time they drink. If we must suggest one of these questions to give us a clue to alcoholism, it will have to be the 3rd. Do you drink more than you intend to? It seems to me that this is the key to defining alcoholism and really the only way the alcoholic is different from the social drinker. Stinkin' thinkin'. This is a phrase that is taken directly from 1,000 conversations among and with alcoholics. It is the way they describe the whole syndrome of resentments, distorted reasoning, defensive arguments, and mixed-up logic that often overtakes an alcoholic. It is sometimes referred to as a dry drunk, and very often, if not dealt with, precedes a wet drunk. Since this stinkin' thinkin' is most often seen in an alcoholic who is still drinking or who is in the early stages of recovery, it seems to me that it is directly related to the effect that alcohol has on the brain. We know of the permanent brain damage that can be caused by alcohol, but I don't think we're concerned enough with the temporary damage. I have had many alcoholics tell me that they really didn't start to think clearly until they had been sober for 6 months, and sometimes the confused state lasted for as long as 2 years. We are often baffled with what passes for reasoning in the mind of the practicing alcoholic, but we do recognize it because of the use of alcohol. We seem, however, to expect the alcoholics to become perfectly clear and lucid by the time they have gone through the withdrawal stage, usually 3 or 4 days. I'm amazed at the ability of the body to restore itself when alcohol is withdrawn. The liver gets better, the pancreas starts functioning, the heart loses some of its inflammation, and all the organs, unless they have passed the point of no return, get back to more normal functioning. It must also be so with the nervous system. We know that nerve tissue is the slowest of all tissue to recover from an injury, and it is the least apt to be fully restored. We must be patient with alcoholics while they are searching for recovery, and we must stay with them during recovery, probably for a longer time than we used to think. We must patiently, lovingly, and firmly bring them back to reality again and again and again. Reality. I suppose none of us are really dealing with absolute reality. Take the matter of coming to grips with our own mortality. We know that we are condemned to death by the very act of being born, but we can deal with this matter many times by pretending that somehow we are going to beat the odds. So We put it away with things we are going to think about later, and it is rare that persons can simply and honestly deal with their own death, which might come the next moment. I have seen some unlikely people, however, when forced by their imminent death to think about it, face it starkly and calmly, and at last coming to grips with reality. In dealing with alcoholics, we are faced with people who don't want to face reality any more than anyone else. In addition, they have discovered an elixir that for years has stood between them and ever more unpleasant reality. One of the problems in dealing with alcohol is that it works for a long time. If one wants to be taller or shorter or richer, more attractive or less inhibited, well, alcohol will do the job. When reality starts to creep back, there is always more of the treatment for sale just down the street. Hitting bottom, for many alcoholics, seems to come at a time when alcohol no longer works for them. Not only is the reality staring them in the face, but it's also a reality that is probably grim because of the results of their drinking. They drink more and more, upon more and more occasions. There is reality looking in the dining room window. How do we get alcoholics to deal with reality? The process is very much like the one dying people must follow if they are to die in peace. First, the alcoholics are simply stunned. The idea that they are alcoholics is simply too much for them to grasp. They cannot make themselves believe that this counselor or friend or someone is telling them that they are alcoholic. It's too much. This stage doesn't last long, but the next one does. That is denial. They will bear any burden, engage in any behavior, and resort to any reasoning to protect this denial. It sometimes goes on for many, many years. If the alcoholic survives the denial period, the next step toward recovery seems to be anger. Okay, so they are alcoholics. Why me? How come you're so smug about being an alcoholic? On and on, through tears and pain and broken hearts and marriages, until they are ready for the next step. Surrender. This is not quitting, but the first positive step to recovery. Until now, they have all been negative. The surrender of the alcoholic or the dying person is beautiful to witness. It is simply placing one's trust in a higher power, come what may. After surrender comes acceptance, and with acceptance comes peace. That is peace to the dying and serenity for the alcoholic. It is no wonder that those of us who see the miracle of recovery are often struck by the resemblance between alcoholic recovery and religious conversion. They both involve surrender to a higher power and the feeling that one must no longer face reality alone, even the reality of surrender or death. Critical judgment. A factor that seems always to be present in the use of alcohol, but which is overlooked by the proponents of responsible drinking, is the loss of critical judgment by the drinker. We see it in the social drinker, when the cocktail party gets louder and more tasteless as the evening progresses. We see it in young drinkers who are trying to decide how to behave after they have had a few drinks. We see it in alcoholics who try to drink in a rational manner and who fail again and again. This is the rock on which the logic of teaching beginning drinkers how to drink flounders, and it sinks the ships of the alcoholics who try to return to the good drinking. We seem to be determined to treat decisions about drinking as though they are a one-time event, and as if a decision made under one set of circumstances will prevail forever. Let's take an example. A senior schoolboy drives with his friends to a wood where a kegger is being held. Before he left home, he decided, based on a good education at school and at home, he decides that if he has had too much to drink, he will not drive home. He goes to the party, and when it's time to go home, he is well intoxicated. It is very likely that his previous decision will not prevail, but that he will now decide on whether he drives home. His critical judgment of his own state is badly distorted by his drinking, and he now makes the decision that he can drive, and he tries it with the consequences that are so appallingly familiar to us. Let's take another example. A well-established alcoholic of long-standing destructive drinking is identified, motivated to treatment, and is dried out. They are taught about the disease of alcoholism and what happens when they drink too much. With their head perfectly clear, they decide that they get into trouble when they drink too much. Tonight at the party, they will have only 2 drinks. They go to the party, they have 2 drinks, and the host offers a third. With the newfound insight brought about on their critical judgment, they decide that surely 1 drink can't hurt anything, and they use the wisdom added by the 3rd drink to decide on the 4th, and so on, far into the night. There's no great mystery here. It's very simple. The only responsible decision one can make about drinking is while one is stone cold sober. Any decision after drinking even 1 drink is going to be influenced by that drink. We live and die daily with the result of that impaired judgment. What, not why. One of the smoothest ways alcoholics can con a counselor into coming to grips with their problems is to get the counselor in a discussion of why. Why do you suppose I drink? Why do I get drunk sometimes and not others? Why are some people alcoholics and not others? Why don't other people understand me as you do? The counselor lays some wisdom on the alcoholic and goes home to work in their garden while the alcoholic goes out and gets drunk. It is only when we keep our eyes steadfastly on the what that we make any progress. I am sure there is a legitimate alcoholism field in which the scientist and researcher can ask why, but for those of us on the firing line, there simply isn't time. What happens when you drink? What does your spouse say about your drinking? What does your boss say when you call in with the flu for the 3rd time in a month? With questions like these, we can save a lot of time, cut through a lot of nonsense, and maybe keep from being conned by experts. Maybe the best question of all is, what are you doing here in my office if you don't have a problem? The corollary to the counselor's position is that the alcoholics must stop asking themselves why and get on with the what. Doctors treat cancer without asking why the patient has cancer. Clergy persons pray with sinners without asking why they sinned. Lawyers defend clients without knowing why they committed the crime. Someday maybe we'll know the why of alcoholism. In the meantime, we must deal with the what. It's the progression that fools us. I believe that the definition of alcoholism that describes it as an incurable, progressive, and fatal disease is correct. This seems to fit well with all I have learned. We're familiar with the Jelinek chart that shows alcoholism progression as a smooth, ever-steepening curve that either starts back upward when it reaches the bottom or continues through the bottom to the death of the alcoholic. It is a useful concept and was a tremendous step forward at the time it was published. I think it describes well the average alcoholic. Since I have yet to deal with the average alcoholic, we need more progression curves, probably one for each alcoholic. Alcoholics who don't fit this curve are those who get into trouble the first time they drink at age 14 or thereabouts, and never in their lives drink without getting into trouble. To draw this curve, one would have to draw an almost vertical line. Others whose progression rates don't fit the standard curve are the alcoholics who drink almost successfully all their lives. The progression rate is very gradual. If someone who knows them well does not look back at a lot of years, the rate of progression is almost imperceptible. Another progression that is fairly common is a combination of these. The alcoholic drinks in an almost successful manner until some major trauma strikes. Someone close to them dies, they have surgery, their kids grow up and leave home, they lose their job, or they suddenly come face to face with the fact that we all die. The result is a precipitous progression into serious alcoholism almost overnight. A classic example of this progression is what happens to some people who retire. The combination of retirement, too much leisure, and the aches and pains of aging call for the solace of the bottle, and all their friends remark how it is too bad that they suddenly became alcoholic. They've been alcoholic all the time, probably from their first drink. It is the progression rate that fools us. Depression. Just as fear seems to be an almost universal accompaniment of alcoholism, So is depression. At first, it seems logical because alcohol is a depressant, and added to the usual negative consequences the alcoholic experiences because of their drinking, depression seems to be the result. But it doesn't seem to fit the almost universal feeling that a drink will cheer you up. I think the depression of alcoholics is better understood when one comes to realize that real depression, as contrasted with the regular ups and downs we all have, is really an anesthetic adopted by suffering people to relieve the pain they are suffering. The descent into depression is most painful, but once the sufferer is there, it isn't so bad. They are usually well immobilized and desperately unhappy, but the psychic pain is not nearly so severe. Severe depression is probably well beyond the resources of the average alcoholism counselor and requires the resources of a psychiatrist or psychologist. The alcoholic needs the concerned attention of a caring person because the return from deep depression is extremely painful. If we are going to ask these people to make this journey and to make it without the assistance of the drug they've always used to deal with psychic pain, they are going to need some help. They are going to need the help we can give them. They are going to make the journey back to the world which hurt them in the first place, living in the same situation from which they fled in despair, without the crutch that they have learned to depend on. Somebody had better be there to hold their hand along the way. A word to the professionals. If one wants to really be effective as an alcoholism counselor, it is probably important to know as much as possible about oneself. Since I like to refer to myself as a professional, I decided to find out what that really means. There are many definitions of the word, but the one that caught my attention was this one: a person who makes a business of an occupation in which amateurs frequently engage. I can't think of anything that describes the profession of alcoholism counselor better. Surely amateurs frequently engage in this profession. Most of us were amateurs before we attained the exalted status of professionals. What right do we have to get paid for doing something which amateurs do for nothing? Are we better than they are? In sports, we think that the professionals are supposed to be the cream of the amateurs. I guess the only amateur that I ever heard of in sports who was better than the professionals was Bobby Jones, and he could have turned pro any time. Are we more dedicated than they are? Are we more dedicated than the workman who spends a day at the shop and goes home dog-tired, only to clean up and go out into the storm to take a new member to an AA meeting? Do we like the glory? Do we want to be named most valuable player? Do we like the hero role? And the final and all-important question: what are we doing in this business anyway? If we don't do much better than the amateurs and aren't more dedicated than the amateurs and we don't work any harder than the amateurs, well then what right do we have to call ourselves professionals? I can't answer this question for anyone else. I have difficulty answering it for myself. For me, the answer lies somewhere in the 11th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. It would be worth your while to study this step. One may have the right to call oneself a professional when, through prayer and meditation, one is able to conduct oneself in such a manner that one's needs do not get in the way of those of the clients. There are no coincidences. Some of the best insights I have obtained into the illness of alcoholism and the recovery of alcoholics have been obtained in casual conversations or by just listening to alcoholics. It is a truism among alcoholics that some of the best AA are in a car on the way to or from an AA meeting. Almost always, when discussing a person's recovery, an alcoholic will say something like this: "I don't know why the boss had me in that day of all days to talk about my drinking. A day or two later, and I would have healed up enough where I felt I didn't need help." Or, "It seems strange that my sponsor stopped at my house that Saturday morning. I knew I had enough, but I just couldn't bring myself to go to the hospital. If the sponsor hadn't showed up, I might have killed myself before the weekend was over. I know I wouldn't have gone looking for help." Maybe I can make my point another way. In 1933, prohibition was repealed, and the use of alcohol began the steep climb that has led us to where we are today. In 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded, and its growth has kept pace with the increased problems that have come from the increased use of alcohol. When you're in the business of helping alcoholics recover, you not only come to expect miracles, but you also come to rely on them. Each clear-eyed product recovering alcoholic is a miracle. The insanity of alcoholism is behind, and a life of promise stretches ahead. We seem to succeed best when we trust a power greater than ourselves to show us the way to recovery. Three-legged sobriety. When I was a young man, I worked on many of the local farms. Each working day began and closed with milking the cows. I was asked to squat on a one-legged milk stool, holding the milk pail between my knees and milk with both hands, avoiding the cow's tail and compensating for the sudden movements caused by a myriad of flies. The result was often disastrous. A two-legged stool was no help, and not until I went to work for a calm old man who had built a three-legged milk stool was I able to settle down and get the job done. Now, I've observed alcoholics repeatedly try the route of a one-legged sobriety and two-legged sobriety, but until they realize that they must have the stability of all three legs, they succeed about as well as I did with those cows. The first leg, of course, is physical recovery. Alcoholics must stop drinking. This gives their liver, their pancreas, their stomach, and the rest of their body a chance to begin the miracle of healing. More importantly, it gives their brain a chance to begin the miracle of healing, giving it a chance to work its way back to normal functioning. I have had many alcoholics tell me that they didn't really start thinking very clearly until they have been without a drink for 6 months, and for many, the period is even longer. The second leg is social recovery. Starting with those closest to them, alcoholics must find a new adjustment to people. The old, damaged relationships must be repaired, and new ways of living together must be found. It is at this juncture that many alcoholics are completely baffled. They feel so much different that they can't understand why people insist on treating them in the same old way. It takes a long time before those who have been hurt so badly can ever learn to trust the alcoholic again. Patience is the name of the game. The third leg of sobriety is spiritual recovery. Many alcoholics just can't understand why they keep having relapses. They feel good physically, they get along fine with everybody, but they go out and get drunk. It seems that they feel there is no need for searching out that higher power and making the surrender necessary to attain spiritual recovery. Only when they humble their soul to God as they know God and ask only to know God's will for them for the power to carry it out do they finally go on to solid, lasting, happy sobriety. I used to think there was something wrong with me because I couldn't milk a cow sitting on a one-legged stool. It seems strange that it took me so long to discover the simple solution of a three-legged stool. White-knuckle sobriety. The best way I know to evaluate the quality and hence the durability of an alcoholic's sobriety is to ask simply, "How are you doing?" If the alcoholic's reply is, "Well, I'm not drinking," and then go on to recite how tough it is, how people don't understand, how they still have so many problems, how they can't pay their bills, and to talk about the day's problems and the night sweats, they simply aren't doing it right. If the answer to your question is, "I had no idea how many good things could happen when I got sober," and is followed by a recital of several perfectly ordinary things, you can be sure they have gotten the message. This is a simple concept, like so many things in this business, and yet it is important. Sobriety is not a burden we impose on any already overloaded soul, but it is the lifting of that burden. Relieved of the ever more complex problems of drinking, dealing with the effects of drinking, hiding their drinking, getting enough to drink, and still trying to maintain an ordinary life, alcoholics usually have such an abundance of time and energy upon recovery, they can now deal with life in a manner that brings them joy. A good way for alcoholics to read their own emotional thermometer is to ask simply, "How do I feel today?" If the answer is negative, it is time to go back over the ground again and discover what is going wrong. Many times, this examination will stop a relapse before it becomes inevitable. Alcoholics lie a lot. A superficial observation of alcoholics' behavior reveals a phenomenon that, for lack of a better word, we call lying. It sometimes seems that they will lie when it is easier to tell the truth. The whole fabric of their lives seems to be interwoven with lies. How much they drank, what happened to the money, why they didn't get home when they said they would, why the job didn't get done. The list is endless. The beneficiary of this erroneous information simply dismisses alcoholics as liars and lets it go at that. If we would really understand alcoholics, we can't get off that easily. At first, our examination of these lies seems to indicate that they are told for the same reason that most lies are told, to avoid the consequences of our actions, to be able to do something we want to do, for personal benefits of various kinds, and to protect ourselves from threats. The alcoholic lies for all these reasons, but the careful observer sees something more. We are baffled when alcoholics insist that they are not lying, when it becomes obvious, as it can be, that they are lying. They become angry, hostile, and confused when we insist that they are lying. Let's approach it from a different angle. We know that when alcoholics are drinking, their perceptions are distorted. What we refer to as alcoholic thinking occurs regularly. I recall taking an alcoholic to a hospital who insisted all the way that he couldn't be an alcoholic because there was always milk in the refrigerator for the kids. That makes as much sense as insisting that one cannot have cancer because there was always food on the table. Remember, however, that it made perfect sense to the alcoholic. This man was sober by our usual standards when we went through this exercise, but he was still thinking like an alcoholic. We must conclude then from this and many other observations that alcoholic thinking does not stop when the alcoholic stops drinking. I have no idea how long it takes most alcoholics to get their thinking straight, but I would say that it takes 6 months for many alcoholics, and in some cases a couple of years. Some of the brain damage is permanent and affects alcoholics' behavior for life. Now, if we look at the behavior we have called lying, we see that from the altered perceptions of the alcoholic, it is the absolute truth. They do drink because their spouse nags them about their drinking. The boss simply doesn't appreciate their contributions. They do intend to cut down on their drinking, and they have no idea why they went on another bender when they promised they would stop with 2 drinks. We still don't accept their excuses. We still hold their feet to the fire and talk about what happens when they drink. Patiently and firmly point them toward reality when they would rather live in a world of altering perceptions. But we don't call them liars. Resentments. Alcoholics don't have a corner on resentments, but they sure have their share. Resentments seem to me to be a form of anger, and while we have a feeling that they are directed at someone else, they seem to me to be a form of anger at oneself. Let's think about it for a moment. Who feels the resentments? We do. Who is upset and feels pain and wastes energy? We do. Who lets resentments keep us from doing the things we want to do and should do? We do. All the while, the persons against whom we feel these resentments are very likely unaware that we are angry with them. I think alcoholics feel so much resentment because they carry a tremendous load of guilt and self-loathing, and they find the burden unbearable. To share the load, they direct some of their anger at those around them. If they are sore at others, they don't have to be sore at themselves. To help alcoholics deal with resentment, we must ferret them out one at a time, like rabbits in a woodpile, and deal with them. What has this person ever done to you? Is this the appropriate amount of anger for such a little pinprick? Does it make sense to be sore at your 3rd grade teacher when you're 50 years old? Eventually, through prayer and meditation, through a repeated and thorough self-inventory, the alcoholic will be able to dig out their own resentments and kill their own snakes. Sometimes it doesn't hurt the counselor to go through the same process. If we find we are angry with our clients and for not accepting the message according to the counselor, it's a good time for a little self-examination. Loving is risking. Some years ago, there was a song that was popular which began, "You always hurt the one you love," and many years before that, Oscar Wilde wrote, in the ballad of Reed and Gale, So each man kills the thing he loves. All too often, those quotations are true. Is there some special ingredient of the emotion we call love, which by some perverse logic leads us to say and do things that hurt those for whom we care the most? How can we possibly say, I love you, and mean it, and then do the rotten, painful, shameful things that we do to those we love? I think the answer lies in love and in our own humanness. Love is the purest, least self-seeking emotion we can feel. All barriers are down, all defenses are dropped, and we are wide open. Now arrives on the scene our fallible human nature. We don't necessarily want to hurt those we love and those who love us, but we do anyway. Those are the people we can hurt. If we had a choice of hurting a friend or an enemy, there would be no doubt which one we would lay it on, but our enemies are ready for us. They are dug in behind their defenses, and our slaps and digs pass virtually unnoticed. So who gets hurt when we lash out? Those without defenses, those we love. When alcoholics approach recovery, there has been a lot of hurting going on. They have hurt those around them repeatedly, and they, because they know no other defense, hurt the alcoholic back. Everybody is hurt and scarred. Most everybody has decided that if this is what love brings you, you can have it. As part of the recovery process, we say to the alcoholics, we love you, you too must love if you are to recover. We go to the spouse and say, you too must love. You must drop the defenses you have built. You must accept the vulnerability that goes with love. Is it any wonder that we are sometimes met with unbelief? After being hurt and battered and damaged, alcoholics and their loved ones are most reluctant to drop the defenses that have made their lives bearable and once more accept the risks that go with loving. Caring persons who would help alcoholics recover must show the way, whether they are sponsors, counselors, or friends. They must show they can drop their guard and begin to care. And when they get hurt, as they inevitably will, they must be tough enough to hang in there and keep caring. Maybe that's one of the reasons there are so few real alcoholism counselors. Pain. To paraphrase the words of a writer more skilled than I, many of us live lives of desperate pain. There were about 20 people at the AA meeting, and most of them spoke. To a non-combatant, they were amazingly open and frank. Their comments were highly personal, and the one thing they had in common was pain. Some of them used the word pain and some did not, but it was obvious that they were all hurting badly. Several thoughts went through my mind. One is that people we call addicts or alcoholics are probably more sensitive to psychic pain than is the rest of us. Just as some people visit the dentist with no trepidation whatsoever, while others are afraid of the slightest physical pain, I think it is so with psychic pain. The second thought is that the toxic substances which we call alcohol and drugs seem to work better in the beginning for some people than for others. Very often, users and boozers use their drug of choice to mask the pain rather than to produce pleasure. Now we have people who are extra sensitive using a substance that works extraordinarily well, a sure recipe for trouble. The sensation of using these substances is painful. People not only have to deal with the pain of withdrawal, but they must accept this pain without the medication they have been using for pain. They also must deal with the pain they have bypassed by using the substance of their choice. As always, I marvel, not that so few get well, but that any ever get well. The Emperor's New Clothes. We all remember the fable of the Emperor's New Clothes. A couple of con men convinced the emperor of a far country that they could make him a set of magnificent robes that could only be seen by those who deserved their position in life. He and all those around him couldn't see the clothes, but pretended to do so, lest they be found unworthy. Finally, a little boy with nothing to lose said, "But the emperor has no clothes," and the hoax was over. In a modern parallel fable, there is a movie called An Elephant in the Living Room, which speaks about the alcoholic in the family. The alcoholic is there, big as an elephant, but everyone goes about their business as if there was nothing there. I'd like to carry this idea a little further. If you're going to have the elephant in the living room, you're going to have to feed it. The chances are that it will take most of the family's income and much of their attention to feeding the elephant, even though they don't admit it's there. The result of all the feeding is inevitable. Much of the family's time is spent cleaning up. We shovel, mop, and haul, while all the time pretending that it isn't really an elephant. The moral here is so obvious that it doesn't need to be drawn. It's profitable, however, to extrapolate from the family to the nation. We have the elephant in the living room. A lot of us spend our days feeding the elephant and a lot more cleaning up after it. Our response when someone asks a question is, "What elephant?" When you're ready, you're ready. I had just finished speaking to an open AA meeting and was basking in the nice things people said about my talk. When things had quieted down a little, two men who had been waiting on the outskirts came to me separately. One told me that he had been sober since hearing me speak 16 years before, and one 10 years. My ego was nearing an unmanageable size when a disquieting thought occurred to me. I have always been aware of how little it sometimes takes for a non-drinking alcoholic to return to drinking. It can be some little event, often manufactured by the alcoholic for that purpose, and they are often running. We well understand that the alcoholic had decided to return to drinking and was searching for an excuse. Let's turn it around. A drinking alcoholic has decided to quit and is busy searching for an excuse. Often the excuse to stop drinking seems as flimsy as the excuse to return to drinking. My hat size returned to normal, and I thanked them both for their comments. As I often do in dealing with alcoholics, I learned a lesson. It doesn't matter very much what you say, but what matters is that you do say something. The alcoholic will use it or not. That's not your problem. Your responsibility is to be there in case someone is ready. Humility and humiliation. There was a long article in one of the papers the other day promoting one more program which promised an easier, softer way to sobriety. It was directed toward women and focused entirely on raising an alcoholic woman's self-esteem. That is highly commendable, and such a program in conjunction with AA might go a long way toward repairing the damage and facilitating the recovery of women alcoholics. But like so many other such programs, it is fatally flawed by considering alcoholic women as a special case. They do have special needs, just as African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans. And just as each recovering alcoholic has special needs, no matter what classification we put them in. It is even likely that programs designed to meet those specific needs will facilitate recovery. But since alcoholism is an illness, the common need for recovery may be met in AA. Without going into detail, the lack of understanding of the program in question is typified because its promoters see the first suggested step of AA as the final degradation which women must undergo to find sobriety. It is the first positive step toward recovery. One has only to witness the overwhelming sense of relief and joy that the alcoholic feels when he or she makes that step to realize it gives a positive, glorious feeling of escape, as though an unbearable burden has been lifted. Alcoholism has brought a dreadful piece of humiliation to most alcoholics. Once they find the road to recovery, have worked their way through the drunkalogs, have done their 4th and 5th steps, have learned to trust a higher power, and are doing their best to carry the message to other alcoholics, they find real humility. They accept the role that God has chosen for them, and they are truly grateful. I didn't fit in. I think that many of us felt like outsiders when we were growing up. It seemed like everyone else was part of a group, had a good time, made inside jokes, knew things that we didn't, and in general had found their places in society. We, on the other hand, were still searching for a place to belong. What we didn't know was that those young people who seemed so cool to us probably had the same feelings. They too were seeking relationships and groups that would make them feel accepted and important. Many of us, through sheer force and awkwardness, found those relationships we needed. The process was often painful, and we often found the rejection we feared so much, but we worked out something that satisfied our needs. I have often heard alcoholics say those fateful words, "I just didn't fit in." The difference between them and non-alcoholic persons was that they found an easier, softer way to deal with these feelings of loneliness and rejection. They discovered the magic of alcohol. It was not necessary for them to push and probe and search until they found the right person or situations. They just had a couple of beers. It worked for them, sometimes for quite a while. They could date and dance and flirt and relate if the alcohol was present. They avoided the necessity of learning to adjust and, in short, just didn't grow up. When they reached the point where alcohol was no longer productive and, in fact, became counterproductive, they were forced to learn a means of adjustment, which they should have learned a long time ago. That learning is just part of the process of finding joyful sobriety. Alcoholic families. We who would help the alcoholic are always looking for new clues and methods of diagnosis. Sometimes I think we look too hard and a real technique is under our noses. Often, when I was new at the business, I would be probing the depths of the alcoholic's life, and he or she would volunteer that one of their parents was an alcoholic. Before I really understood the importance of such a remark, I would make a note to myself and go on. Little by little, I would follow up on this clue, mostly to find out what my client called an alcoholic. Gradually, I extended my scope of questioning and discovered that, as well as alcoholic parents, the person in question had alcoholic siblings, aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins, and all sorts of other blood relatives who were alcoholic. Eventually, I came to see the alcoholic as a member of an alcoholic family and, in fact, used that clue to identify in part the alcoholic. Back when I used to believe that alcoholism was a learned behavior, I attributed the phenomenon of an alcoholic family to the turmoil of the family that I felt led to alcoholic drinking. I now believe that there is a real genetic predisposition to alcoholism, which is only realized when the alcoholic begins to drink. There seems to be a disparity in the proportion of alcoholics among heavy drinkers in different cultures, which has led some people to believe that drinking in certain ways, albeit heavy, will prevent alcoholism. I don't believe this is true. I believe that certain cultures will accept more alcoholic behavior before labeling someone alcoholic, and that this accounts for the disparity. Before we get smug about the genetic theory, however, witness the girl who is raised by an alcoholic father, marries an alcoholic husband, eventually divorces him, and then marries another alcoholic. No genes involved here, but we don't know what is involved. A peculiar institution. As a sometime student of history of our country, particularly the Civil War era, I've been fascinated by the convoluted thinking which allowed slavery to exist in what we felt to be a civilized society. One of the cleverest bits of sophistry was to refer to slavery as the peculiar institution. By this means, one was able to contend that the usual rules of living did not apply to this institution, but that it had its own rules, its own morals, and its own acceptable behaviors. I don't intend to refight the Civil War, but I do find it strange. I find strange parallels between the acceptance of the peculiarity of slavery and the peculiarity of the institutions surrounding alcohol. We made the sale of alcohol legal. There is no stigma attached to anyone who in any way deals with alcohol. We accept the taxes related to it gladly. We decry the misuse of alcohol, but feel that the responsible user of alcohol has no problems. When the best and brightest of our young people die in alcohol-related incidents on our highways, we scarcely miss a beat. When families are destroyed under our very noses by alcohol, we go blithely on. When every sort of alcohol-related brutality is reported daily in our papers, we barely read the stories. Like slavery, the use of alcohol has its own rules that are not rules of everyday behavior. We have a special set of attitudes toward alcohol, and when someone tries to apply the rules and laws of decency, morality, and logic to the use of alcohol, the protests are deafening. The use of alcohol must have its own rules and morality because it could not exist under the ordinary rules of living. The use of alcohol, like slavery, is truly a peculiar institution. A higher power. I had spoken briefly at a closed AA meeting about the spiritual nature of the recovery of the alcoholic, and afterward I was stopped by a young couple who wanted to talk. "What can you suggest," the young woman asked, "for a young person who cannot accept the idea of God as a higher power?" Most of us heavy thinkers in the field of helping the alcoholic have discussed this matter endlessly. I really didn't have a good answer for her, but I started to give her the old standard about alcohol being a higher power, and that surely there was something more powerful than this nasty tasting, evil smelling substance. It didn't seem to be going over, and with one part of my mind, I began to prepare to talk about an AA group being a higher power for some, but again, that didn't seem to be what we needed. As I talked, the thought came to me that the answer was there in front of me, plain as anything. A real good higher power to start with, I said, is love. Not sexual love, not friendship, because both demand something in return. The higher power we need is what the Greeks call agape. My words didn't register, but they were still listening. Agape love, I went on, is the love that brought these old-timers here tonight. Not because they need a meeting, but because you need a meeting. Agape love is the love that sends food to other countries, even though we know that much of their starvation is caused by political and natural causes. Agape is love that prompts people to work in care centers, take care of the elderly for low pay and little recognition. Agape is a love that gives and gives, but expects nothing in return. I could see their faces brightening. They understood, and for a little while, so did I. Quality sobriety. Every so often, a new phrase creeps into the vocabulary of entrance into the alcoholic derby. Using this word or phrase, the user seems to be trying to stake out some new territory, thus establishing his or her credibility in the field, and this assuring that when they find out how unrewarding working with alcoholics can be, they will be able to move on to bigger and better things. One of these phrases is quality sobriety. In rebuttal, I can only offer the opinion of an old-timer I know. If it ain't quality, it ain't sobriety. Members of Alcoholics Anonymous have known this for a long time. They differentiate for themselves the difference between being dry and being sober. Dry means not drinking. Sober means recovering from the cunning, baffling, and powerful illness we call alcoholism. Another way the members of AA define sobriety that isn't quality is the dry drunk. This describes the non-drinking alcoholic who still suffers the whole galaxy of feelings and behavior we find accompanying drinking, but without the help of the booze to deal with them. The alcoholic and everyone around the alcoholic are miserable. As is often the case, Alcoholics Anonymous has been there first. Putting a new name on an old problem doesn't do a thing. If the new entrants to the Derby studied the program of AA thoroughly, they would discover that both the definition of the problem and the solution of the problem have already been discovered. Spare us your catchphrases. Other groups. The obvious success of Alcoholics Anonymous has given birth to countless other self-help or 12-step groups. And since the alcoholic is not much different than any other person, he or she has many other problems in their life that need fixing. It's only natural that many alcoholics find themselves in groups that propose to help them lose weight, stop gambling, treat sex as most persons do, or deal with the result of being raised by alcoholic parents. These groups are noteworthy and do help many people, including recovering alcoholics. Therein lies the problem. AA has gained its success by focusing solely on one problem, that of alcoholism. The alcoholic can gain success only by an intensive focus on one thing, recovery. I'm sure it is possible to recover from more than one thing at a time, but too often we see persons lose their focus on alcoholism, and the result is the loss of sobriety. An excellent example is a prestigious doctor who really understands at least the physical and neurological aspects of alcoholism, insisting that the alcoholic stop smoking, stop drinking, and stop using caffeine while in the recovery process. Another leader wants the alcoholic to adopt a highly structured diet, give up jolts of sugary food, and stop drinking coffee. Another problem is when such an important organization as Adult Children of Alcoholics takes over center stage for the recovering person. All these perspectives overlook one basic fact about alcoholism. It is unique. The illness is unique, the recovery is unique, and the recovering alcoholic's subsequent life is unique. We cannot cloud the issue. We must keep the alcoholic's attention unwaveringly focused on the disease. I'm sure there is a place for the other groups, but only when we are sure that they will not take the focus off the individual's recovery. The mosaic of sobriety. We have all stood before many colored mosaics, marveling at the skill and patience of artists who take such small pieces and make them into such a beautiful whole. I often stand before the long-term sobriety of alcoholics with the same feeling. The analogy goes further. Look more closely at the mosaic. It is made of innumerable tiny pieces, none of which has made much beauty by itself. They are little bits of glass and stone at which we would scarcely glance in passing. The artists have beautiful, powerful pictures in their minds and have put these bits and pieces together so that we too can see the beauty they see. When alcoholics approach sobriety, they have in their mind a vague outline of what their sobriety should look like. As the artists do, they select little bits and pieces. A sentence from the big book here, a thought from the 24-hour book there, an idea picked up from an AA meeting all come together. None of these seem very important to us, but as we watch, the outline of the alcoholic's sobriety begins to emerge. Sometimes they take out a piece and replace it. Sometimes the pattern shifts, but as time goes on, we can see more and more what their sobriety is like. No picture is like any other, but we can stand before them and say, this is sobriety. As the years pass, they add to their mosaic of sobriety until the rich and colorful picture of long-term sobriety emerges, and we stand in awe. What part do we who would help the alcoholics have to play in this creation? We can provide the bits and pieces. We must never say, that little piece doesn't amount to anything. We won't give it to the alcoholic. For all we know, it is just a piece they have sought to fill the empty place in their mosaic of sobriety.